So good afternoon, everyone. Today, the continuation of the lecture series. We were discussing about last week about the Bills of Exchange Ordinance, and we've discussed quite some and the majority part of it. And there's the last bit of it will be discussed today. More to the practical side of it, of course, we can discuss. If you have any questions, you can ask me. I hope there are so many people still joining in. As they join in, if you all have any questions or clarifications, you could ask from me. So the last we discussed last week was with regard to accounts pay crossings, and then account pay crossings. Thereof, we discussed that it's not covered in the Bills of Exchange Ordinance, but it is a practice that has come up over a period of time in the banking industry and as a banking practice. Further, from today, we are going to discuss about this drawers and certain other parties' liability with regard to the checks that they have issued. So you get the drawer, you get the drawee. The drawee with regard to checks would be more or less the banks, because if it's a check, there should be a bank involved. And we discussed about the paying banks responsibility as well as the collecting bank's responsibility. Just give me a moment. Right. Now, we spoke with regard to the stale checks. It's disheartening sometimes to see that certain individuals who ought to know the meaning of stale checks do not know actually. I mean, with my practice in the profession that I am in, I do understand that I've come across certain instances, even the parties who we look upon at a very high level do not understand the meaning of stale checks, but yet the very people who deal with, they may not be having a formal education as to what a stale check is all about, or for that matter, Bills of Exchange Ordinance to the laws surrounding it. But the merchants, when you go to PETA or somewhere, they know in and out of the periphery of what you can do and what you can't do with bills of exchange, or rather checks, we call it. So, being a banker, it's very important that you understand this as well as what you can do in practice as well, right? So, the practical aspect of it, no matter how much you know with regard to theory, it doesn't matter, or it's not that what you call valuable if you don't have the practical knowledge and the sense. We will deal with this in a little while. Now, we know stale checks by now is the 6 months rule in Sri Lanka, and in some other countries the rule is lesser than 6 months. the in some other countries you get checks where the validity is 180 days. You need to understand the drawer has the ability to further restrict the validity period of a check from 6 months to lesser numbers, to 90 days or 30 days. If the drawer or any holder for that matter has that ability to further restrict it, and thereafter, again, nevertheless, it started as a check valid for 6 months. You cannot further negotiate it or transfer it if you have restricted the period of validity. Then you The most often used term by the bankers are PD checks. What do you mean by PD checks or post-dated checks? Bankers should have a good understanding with regard to the legal rules related to post-dated checks. Right? Normally, the person who draws a check will put a date in the check on which is drawn. However, he can put an earlier date also. You call it an antecedent date, or else you can put a post date also. Right? Now, antedated and post-dated and to date. If you put an antedate or earlier date, you need to keep in mind the validity period of the check. It will be lesser than, right? Because if you draw a check with the date today, the check will be valid for 6 months if there are no further restrictions. 6 months from today. If you put an earlier date in the check, for an example, 1 month before, today is 1st of August, if you put the date 1st of July, the validity period of the check would be, in practice, 5 months. In practical sense, 5 months from today. Because 1 month earlier, you have indicated as the date. Right? Right. So, with regard to post-dated checks, right, there are 3 categories. Keep in mind. Checks with the date on which they are drawn, which I told you first, and then antedated checks and post-dated checks. Now, if you look at section 13, subsection 2 of, I will put it on this. Section 13. The presumption as to the date of being true date. A bill is not invalid by reason only that it is antedated or post-dated, or that it bears a date on a Sunday. This is an important provision with regard to the bills of exchange ordinance. And also keep in mind, I don't know whether I have covered this last week, with regard to omission of date in a bill payable after date, accepted after sight. Now, since this acceptance and acceptance before payment and acceptance or honoring all these concerns with regard to the normal bills of exchanges are not applicable for checks, you don't have to be worried about acceptances because all these matters happens at the same time for a check. Right? Now, section 12 says, where a bill expressed to be payable at a fixed period after date is issued undated, right? Where a bill or a check expressed to be payable at a fixed period after date. So, more or less, they are talking about post-dated checks. Or where the acceptance of a bill payable at a fixed period after sight is undated. Now, that portion doesn't come in the relevant to the checks because checks are payable on demand, not at a fixed period after sight. So you don't need to present it for acceptance or present it for payment. With regard to checks, it's payable on demand, right? Is undated, any holder may insert therein the true date of issue or acceptance, and the bill shall be payable accordingly. Now, what you need to understand is you may accept undated checks and the holder may insert the true date which it was given. That's what the law says. So when you talk about when you hear this term true date, there is a sense of integrity that is expected from the holder. When you look at this section 12, there is a proviso. Proviso says the holder may insert the true date of issue or acceptance. Issue or acceptance. You get a check from your client or customer, whoever, undated, you can put the holder can put the true date, right? And shall be payable accordingly, provided where the holder, that is, let's say you, in good faith and by mistake inserts a wrong date. So they have given some freedom, you can say, to make some mistakes as well. So instead of, let's say, they say today's 1st of August 2020, right? You get a check undated. Then you, without inserting 1st of August 2020, you insert 31st July or whatever, another date, or 1st of August 2019. If you put 2019, then it's a different story. The check is stale. Where the holder in good faith and by mistake inserts a wrong date, and in every case where a wrong date is inserted, if the bill subsequently comes into the hand of a holder in due course, holder in due course. Remember section 29, the bill shall not be avoided. So you can't invalidate the bill, because that protection is given to the HDC, holder in due course, to ensure that these mistakes may happen by human error. So that freedom is given only for such mistakes made by good faith, right? And genuine mistakes. But if you put a wrong date, for an example, I told you earlier, there is a practice that that's in existence where some bankers take checks as security checks. That's illegal. You come across such a situation, there will be penal provisions against the bank and the particular officer who are engaged in such action. So be careful on that. Then section 13, which we are talking about, the post-dated checks, where a bill or acceptance or any endorsement on a bill is dated, the date shall, unless the contrary be proved, be deemed to be the true date of the drawing. So that is something which is connected to the previous section about putting a wrong date and the presumption of it being the true date. Presumption. Hitano, eka salakano, presumption. You presume on the face of it that it's the true date. And also, a bill is not invalid by the reason that it is post-dated, right? Now, why would a person insert a post-dated check? And can anyone participate? Why a customer or a person issue a post-dated check? What's the reason? What's the reason? What do you all think? Why? Bankers? Why? Yes? Why would you issue a check with not today's date but a future date? Any guesses? Any guesses? No idea? There are bankers right here, right? No. Maybe it may be due to so many reasons. One is the agreement may be so that the agreement is that you need to pay him not today but at a determinable future time, maybe 1 month from today. So you put a post date in 1 month from today and give him a check. Or else also you may not have funds in your account and you put a post date where you expect funds to be there in the account before that. So those are the main two reasons why one would put or insert a post date. Now, what is it with regard to what is the importance of this PD or post date insofar as a bank is concerned? Now, you remember we spoke of the dual aspects of a check, a bill of check. One thing is it's a order on the banker, right? It's a mandate given to the banker by the customer. Secondly, the bank is acting as the agent there. So those are the dual role, or the two aspects of the roles played by the check. Now, if the customer assume gives another person a post-dated check today, the date being 30th August 2020, right? And that person, the payee or the holder, goes to the bank, not Monday, Monday is a holiday, on Tuesday, and present it to the bank, right? Can the bank pay or can't the bank pay? I need your answers to this. Right? I'm sorry. Date of the check is 30th August. Right? You give the check to the payee who goes to the bank on Tuesday, which is the 4th of August, right, 2020, and present it to the counter. Can the bank pay or not? I need your answers to this, bankers. Yes. Can't pay. What else? Others? There's quite a lot of people here. Unless you will have logged in. Okay. Yes. Okay. Good. Keep them coming in. Can't pay. Can't. Yes. Good. Now, why can't you pay? Because the date is not before the date that you were supposed to pay. So it's 4th. You look at the check. What do you check? What do you check in the check? Times. You look at the name, you get the number, amount written in words, amount written in figures, then the date, signature, and all these things you verify. When you look at the date, you see it's not a date, which is a future date. You have not come to that date yet. So if you come to a position where the bank has already paid, right? The bank is liable. Very good. Your answers are correct. You can't pay. If you come to that position, the customer would go to financial difficulty, and the bank would be liable on the full amount of the check, because if it dishonors, the bank has to indemnify the customer because of lack of funds, and bank is fully liable on that towards the customer. So be careful with regard to that, right? There are several judicial decisions with regard to paying post-dated checks which are not valid. If it is being paid before that and it's been dishonored, the bank is liable. You have to see, these are the cases. I will give you one out of so many. These are quite old cases. I'll give you there are so many, but these are the National Bank Limited, 1944. You're not, it's not expected from you to know all these references with regard to the years and the dates. Why I'm giving you is when you are giving a case, you need to understand, you need to give the full particulars of the case, right? Now, in one of these cases, what happened was, on 6th of November, not this case, in a similar earlier case, the plaintiff gave a post-dated check for £15 and 17 shillings and 9 dimes. Right? These are the denominations which they use, shillings and dimes. Let's say £15. The date of that is 15th December 1900. Right? It was presented for payment before this date, namely 12th December. So check date is 15th December. It was presented to the bank on the 12th of December, without regard whatsoever on the date being a post date. It was paid by the bank, the defendant bank. So the plaintiff gave the check on 13th December again, and it was paid by the bank. So what happened? The questions that arose and had to be determined was whether the payment by the defendant bank of the post-dated check on 12th December was wrongful or not, whether or not the plaintiff was entitled to the damages of that particular amount. Right? It was held, decided by the court, that a bank is not entitled to pay a post-dated check before its date and charge the amount to its customer's account, or to treat the checks as a bill presented for acceptance and hold the customer's fund to meet it. Right. This is the golden rule with regard to payment of checks, payment of post-dated checks. Now we are coming to the last bits of the bills of exchange and the laws related to checks with regard to countermanding or stopping the payment of checks. Countermanding, right, of a check is also known as stop payment, right, of a check. A customer is entitled to make a stop payment order, right, before it was once after it is issued and before presentment for payment, right? It's their prerogative. They have the right. It's their instructions to the bank, right? It's a concept of law of agency. Although it is recognized in the Bills of Exchange Ordinance, it's based on this principal agent, again, this relationship, where in that law it's well established that the authority of the agent, here the bank, may be revoked by the principal. So principal can at any time revoke the authority given to the agent to act on his behalf. So this is an authority given to the bank to act or debit the customer's account on his behalf, right? That's why you can't, as the banker, we can't debit or deal with the customers, deal with the accounts as we wish without the customer's authority. We can debit the account without customer, so you need to debit the authority of the customer, because that's not our account, that's customer's account, right? So there should be several reasons that the drawer of the check may wish to stop its payment. Maybe if the check is stolen, right, or it's lost, or the consideration which it was given was not paid. These are the areas why a drawer would countermand the payment, right? Now, while the Bills of Exchange Ordinance speaks of a countermand terminating the authority, it does not indicate that the Bills of Exchange, who is entitled to countermand, what constitutes countermand, and the manner in which it should be communicated to banks, that's not covered. However, there are certain prerequisites by the decisions of the courts, which has now pronounced and accepted, and it's been practiced over a period of time, and it is more or less equivalent to law and as accepted, right? Pratiniyoga, countermanding. So prerequisites: a bank cannot act on conjecture and dishonor a check, right? The customer's instructions to stop payment should be clear. Stop payment should be clear, unambiguous, unequivocal, and unmistakable, right? The customers, these are very important instructions to stop payment should be clear, unambiguous, unequivocal, and unmistakable. Keep this in mind, very important, right? Give me one. Sorry about that. Right. So, we were discussing that is covered. I will give you the case references. My goodness. This. How do you go? Right. References. You can jot these references down. Give me a moment. Take note of these references. Westminster Westminster Bank Limited versus Hilton, 1926, 136 LT 315 at page 317 and 321. This is recorded, so you can replay for the references. Not to worry, right? Now the crucial issue is not the method of countermand, but the way that you have communicated that to the bank, whether it was properly informed to the bank. So it should not be confusing. It should not be ambiguous as well. You can't once if you receive an instruction from the customer to the effect, for an example, let's say, can you stop the payment of my check issued to the value of 300,000? It's ambiguous, right? Why do I say it's ambiguous? Because there may be several checks which was issued at 300 rupees, 300,000 rupees. So whenever they are mentioning these things, what they should state is the check number, issue date, in favor of whom this. So all those information should be mentioned, right? And then the other thing that you need to keep in mind is constructive notice of countermand is not sufficient. The bank must have actual notice of countermand, and that constructive notice is not enough. So for example, countermand is really a matter of fact. It's a matter of fact. It means much more than a change of purpose on the part of the customer. The change of customer part of the customer. In addition, the notification of that change of purpose to the bank, there is no such thing as constructive notice or countermand in commercial transaction of any kind. You can't say you can't call the bank and let's say inform the bank. You see, I've issued a check for this amount, and the customer didn't pay me money, or he didn't perform the services that he undertook, then you can't expect the banker to countermand the payment, because there is no constructive notice of countermand. You have to give specific instructions to the bank in order to countermand the payment. The bank must be informed of the countermand before the payment of the check, right? And presumably within a reasonable time before the check is presented for payment. And that's a responsibility on the part of the customer. Now, in Baines versus National Provincial Bank Limited, 1927, 96 LJ King's Bench, KB 801. It was held that a customer, where a customer who was a bookmaker issued a check, a short time before his bank closed, so that the payee could not normally cash it in the same day, right? The next morning, he sent his son to the bank to stop its payment, but the payee had called at the bank the previous day, a few minutes after closing time, and the bank had paid the check. It was held that the bank was not liable because the bank was entitled to deal with the check within a reasonable time after its advertised closing date. So there is a protection given to the bank. All these are not covered in the Bills of Exchange ordinance. However, the bank came as a practice by decided cases. The bank should be aware of what its uh, framework which it can act upon. Now, these old methods of countermanding by telephone and email, all these things, the method of countermanding, or rather the mode of countermanding, how are you going to countermand? By a WhatsApp message, can you do that? By email, can you do that? By telephone, can you do that? All these things comes into play. It all depends on what the agreement the customer has with the bank, whether it is allowed, and whether there are arrangements taken place to that effect with the bank, and if not, the bank can't do that, right? uh, so bank's right to debit customer with stop check. Bank that pays a check after it has been effectively countermanded is liable to the customer, right? Very simple. Then now it's funny, I want this answer from you all, right? What is a banker's draft? Please answer this question. What is a banker's draft? Bankers out there, what is a banker's draft? Send it to me. What is a banker's draft? I'll give you half a minute. What's a banker's draft? Yes. Have you heard of a banker's draft? You should be. Hmm? Good. I'm getting answers. Yes. What else? It's a bill of exchange drawn on a banker payable upon itself. What else? And at the same time, um, there are in the industry, a banker's draft is known who identified very good. In the industry, a banker's draft is identified in several names. Banker's draft is one of them. What are the other names? What are the other names? Banker's draft. What are the other names to a banker's draft? There are certain indications in your answers as well. Because I've seen some heads of uh, departments, some heads of functions doesn't know certain terminologies, and I've come across several instances where they have even went to the verge of what do you call rejecting certain checks being named differently. Bank check, okay. What else? Good. Bill of exchange is not a term that is used. No, bill of exchange is not a term used for bankers draft. Tellers checks, okay. What else? What else? What else? Remember, bankers drafts, tellers checks, bank check, cashier's orders, check on self. These are all checks drawn on a banker by the bank. So it's a check, cashier's order to the cashier. But the difference is the drawer and the drawee are one and the same person, the bank, right? Keep in mind, these are, you may see this as simple stuff that anyone would know, but it's not the case. Not everyone knows, but sometimes it's surprising that certain people who ought to know doesn't know that. Then you get all the chills of petrifying, right? Now, certain standard phrases. So, what type of the bankers out here? I need your help. What type of instances? Now, you check, there are check return notifications, CRNs in your terminology. What are the types of reasons a bank would return the checks? Over to you. Yes. What are the reasons a bank would return a check in bankers terminology? Yes, I need. There are a few couple of dozens of reasons. So, oh right, okay, right. Non-sufficient funds in your death of drawer. Yeah. So these are the reasons. So what my expectation is you mention the reason and the reason and the phrase, the standard phrase you use. So payment stopped by drawer. Very good. That's the terminology. So the phrase you use is payment stopped by drawer. What else? Account close. Mismatch of signatures. Tail check. Wow. Very good. What else? What else? The easiest method for you to do that is go and check any CRN, check return notification forms. There are certain check returns where you can present the check again or you can't. Payment postponed, pending drawers confirmation. Very good. Right. So look at the back of the CRN. You see all the reasons with the return codes in 41, 60, 51, whatever. Mandate determined. Very good. So, Dilukshi, what do you mean by mandate determine? What do you mean by mandate determine? Your answer is correct, right? While she answers, I'm taking your attention to section 9, right? Here, sum payable, it says, sum payable, right? It's there. This is section 9, where section 9(2), where the sum payable is expressed in words and also in figures, and there is a discrepancy between the two. The sum denoted by the words is the amount payable. Section 9(2), right? Section 9(2), Bills of Exchange Ordinance. You get a check to be paid, let's say over the counter. It says pay so and so 145,000 rupees. 145,000 rupees. And then the amount stated in figures is 14,500. Will you pay the check or no? Will you pay the check or no? Will you pay the check or no? In words, it states 145,000 rupees. In figures, it's 40,500. Will you pay the check or no? I need your answers. Paying on the amount in words. Good. Dilukshi, your answer is correct with regard to Dover's mandate determined. Very good. Uvinya, correct, your answer. Dilshan, paying on amount in words. Others? No. Okay, no. All your answers are correct. So some of you all are saying, no, you don't pay. And possibly looking into account holders confirmation. Good. Yeah, Dilshan. But actually, do you all do these things? Do you all actually call the customer and get their confirmation on this? Now, insofar as Bills of Exchange Ordinance is concerned, if the banker pays the amount in the words, stated in the words and not in the figures, that's okay. But there is a practice also to the effect that some bankers, what they do is they look at the amount stated in the words and figures and they pay the lower amount to be on the safer side. That's not an accepted practice. And at the same time, now you know that the bankers are the most risk averse people in the earth, right? It's just pun intended. It's the truth as well. No fault on their part, but that is the case. But in such situations, they sometimes they would return the check as this. They can return the check with this because they used to do that. But check on CRNs, check return notification forms, whether they can do these types of return notification. So you can return for lack of funds. For an example, effects not realized, you can say if the effects or the funds are under collection, right? If it's just clearing, Or you can also say funds attached or garnished. You can there are certain instances where there are funds in the account, but there is a court order on the balance of the account. So what happens is there is funds in the account. Customers, let's say there is funds in the account. Let's say 200,000. There's a check incoming to be paid for 50,000 rupees. But at the same time, there is a hold placed on the account, not a hold, rather, there's a attachment because of a court order. You have received a court order to remit, let's say 150,000 or 100,000 in favor of the court for some other matter. Then you can't say if it's not realized or insufficient funds, whatever. You have to say funds attached or garnished. Garnished. It's a legal term. Funds attached, garnished. Right? Maybe from the Inland Revenue Department. Right? So the or a writ issued by a court in respect of judgment debt. Right? An injunction issued by court. Court attaches the balance of the amount. So these are, or maybe under the money laundering, anti-money laundering, Prevention of Money Laundering Act, or Financial Transactions Reporting Act, or under the Financing of Terrorism Act. All these laws come into play. These are the situations, right? Or check scheduled in error, check incomplete, check irregularly drawn, check crossed to two banks, checks not drawn in accordance with the mandate if somebody else has signed, or only one person has signed if the requirement is two persons to sign. Drover's mandate ambiguous. Drover's signature required defense. Drover deceased. Drover's mandate inoperative by law, where you use this in circumstance. Drover's mandate inoperative by law. I think some of you all have, have mandate determined. Is what this is all about. If there's the Drover is, you have covered it all, the look sheet. If the one thing is notice of customer's bankruptcy, notice of the lunacy of the drover, notice of an assignment by a customer of the credit balance assigned to somebody else, not somebody else, to some other matter. For an example, let's say there is a balance in the account of 100,000 issued, the customer has issued a check for 50,000. At the same time, customer has given notice to the bank to use that balance on the account for repayment of a loan, right? Then the bank has to act according to the instruction of the customer. If the bank is not clear, they have to get the verification by the customer as to what needs to be done. Or endorsement irregular, endorsement illegible, endorsement required, right? So mutilation, all these things comes into play. So that's about bills of exchange ordinance and the checks related to this. You need to be 100% confident with this, 100% savvy and familiar with the provisions. We took some time to discuss about these provisions because I gave this time, use this time. It is that important to know what we are talking about, right? Any questions before we start on the new topic? That's about bills of exchange ordinance and laws with regard to checks. And when you look at the past papers and the history, and also you don't have to look at the past papers and the history. This is a area, the bankers education, this program. It's safer to say that you can't talk about a banker's education or banker's qualification without checks, because that is an integral part with regard to the banking system and the operation of the banking industry itself. It's pathetic. I must also say this. Sometimes when you look at the knowledge of certain bankers, when you frequently visit I frequently visit the branches, and I sometimes out of sheer curiosity, they sometimes don't know who I am, or certain instances I ask certain things. You write certain things out just out of curiosity. so that, to test this knowledge, what our bankers are capable of. So be vigilant. You need to understand what you are doing. It is on that competency that you would be, what do you call, measured upon. All right. So I don't see any questions here, but if you do have, you know how to contact me. Then we are going to start upon a comparatively what do you call, shorter area, right? I am of debt recovery, right? I am not going to talk about all these acts today. I am going to concentrate, and we are going to cover a particular act. Namely, I have already shared this act with you. I think the institute has already shared this act with you, right? That is the Debt Recovery Act number 2 of 1990, amended by the Debt Recovery Act, Debt Recovery Amendment Act of 5 of 1994. Debt Recovery Amendment Act. Sorry, not 5, 9 of 1994. Right? You can open your acts for us to go through this. This is, if you all can, I will open on the screen as well. Right? Let me right. This is one. And then Amendment Act. Debt Recovery Special Provisions. අංක 2 1990 අංක 2 දරන ණය අපහසු ආයකර ගැනීමේ පනත. So Debt Recovery Special Provisions, විශේෂ විධිවිධාන පනත. Special Provisions Act number 2 of 1990. Right? Keep this in mind. This particular act can be used only by certain people. Now, this is a recovering act, recovery of debt. We will see who can use this, what's so special, what's so significant about this act. But in order to explain that, I need to explain to you about the normal recovery process. In the first lesson, I think you have or maybe covered with regard to the recovery procedure in a nutshell, right? Now the purpose of this Debt Recovery Act is to provide a special procedure or a speedy procedure to recover of debt through courts, right? And you call it the procedure that is applicable or applied as the summary procedure. Majority of the important provisions of this Act number 2 of 1990 were amended by the amending Act of 9 of 1994, right? About 4 years after. The special thing about this act is you can't use this act by anyone for anything, in the sense for everything. There should be certain requirements if you want to use the provisions of this act. For an example, if there is let's say a loan is granted to the customer, right? A loan is granted. What happens is, if the customer defaults on payment, the first thing you do is you discuss with the customer as to what can be done with regard to regularizing the matter. That this is the practical world, right? What you can do with regard to regularize the account from going NPL or non-performing loans to performing category. If you can do that, then that's fine, no issues at all. But provided if the customer cannot get it on board and it goes on to NPL, what you should do is then the legal gets involved. The legal department gets involved. What happens is they send what you call a letter of demand to the customer. Entaravasiya, in Sinhala you call it. So in the letter of demand you say you owe such and such amount to the bank, you've been given this facility, but the agreement was such that you have to pay this, but you have failed in your repayments and you have our default of this account. Then the customer may or may not reply. Then what you do is, depending on the amount that is defaulted, you file a plaint in the courts to recovery of money. When you file a plaint in the courts for recovery of such money, there is a process involved. The normal process is called a regular procedure. What you do is you draft the plaint, your legal or your lawyers draft the plaint and they file it in courts. You may need to relook at this video over and over again of this explanation. What happens in a money recovery process, and you draw down your own charts of the regular procedure. So letter of demand, then there's a reply or not, admitting or not, and then you decided, the bank decides that they need to recover the money through courts. So then you file a plaint in courts with the agreements, the facility offer letters and the facility agreement forms that you have entered into with the customer. So what happens is, once you file that in courts, the courts through its fiscal, before that through registered post, send that plaint together with notice to appear to the customer concerned. Sitasiya කියලා කියන්නේ summons will be sent out with a date, okay, on or before there is a action instituted against you for recovery of money, and you have to file answer on or before this date, and you are summoned to court to file your answer. Then comes and files the answer. Once the answer is filed, I am shortening the actual process a lot here, and I'm just giving you the gist of this. They comes and files the answer. They have a right to come and file the answer. And after looking at the plaint and the answer, the courts frames the issues and admissions of both parties. If the customer says, yes, I am a customer of this bank and this is the account that I hold with the bank, that's an admission. So you don't need to go into that area to determine whether there is an issue with that. No. So admissions are framed, and admissions are mentioned, recorded, and issues are framed. Issues are framed according to the pleadings. Pleadings are what each party says in their plaint and the answer. So claim and the answer. Once that is done, then the case will be fixed for trial, right? All this framing of issues and admissions will be done at the pre-trial stage, you call it. Then at the trial, what happens is the bank will commence the case by producing evidences of witnesses and documents. Once the case of the bank is concluded, if the customer wants to, present his part of the story, he can produce his documents, witnesses, and evidence. And after which the parties will submit their written submissions on that, and the court will pronounce an order on that or the judgment. Now, in order to do that, what I just mentioned this in 5 minutes, it takes couple of years, on average about 3 to 4 years for an early recovery action to conclude. That is, of course, in the original court. And once that order is given, if one party is not satisfied, you get the provision or the capacity or the entitlement rather to appeal it to the next level, right? To the next level. You can appeal it to the High Court of Civil Appeals and thereafter to the Supreme Court. So the process goes on. The 3 to 4 years will be only at the original court stage. So you remember this is called the regular procedure. And in regular procedure, the customer has a right to come and file their answer. Now, what's so different about this Debt Recovery Act is you saw that if you read not this. Right. An act to provide for the regulation of the procedure relating to debt recovery by lending institutions, right? By lending institutions and for matters connected there with an incident thereto. Now, as I said, this Debt Recovery Act is far more amended by this amending act, right? Now, by this amending act, they have repealed, that means they have taken out this old provision with regard to section 2 and they have replaced say Act number 2 of 1990 and section 2 is hereby amended by repeal of subsection 2 of section 2, right? Now, so you have to have in your possession the original act and the amending act as well. Now, a lending institution, as to what a lending is, action by lending institution for recovery of action. So keep in mind, under this act can be used only by a lending institution. Means subject to provisions of section 2 may recover debt due to it by an action instituted under this by in the district courts. The party defendant resides or the course of action arose. The contracts ought to be enforced. Right, so it is up to the lending institution to go under this act. They can. Now, subsection 2 is amended. No action shall be instituted by an institution in terms of the procedure for the recovery of any debt where the sum alleged to be default is less than 150,000 rupees. So, whatever the amount should be over 150,000 rupees, right? Then, what you need to keep in mind is this. What is a lending institution? Lending institution is covered under section 30 under the interpretations, right? Lending institution means a licensed commercial bank within the meaning of the Banking Act, State Mortgage and Investment Bank, SMIB, NDB, National Development Bank, under the National Development Bank of Sri Lanka Act. Then NSB, National Savings Bank, under the NSB Act. Development Finance Corporation of Ceylon, DFCC Act. A company registered under the Finance Companies Act is now amended and it is now repealed, and you have to see F is replaced by a company registered under the Finance Companies Act. Is different now, it's Finance Business Act, right? Now, not anyone who have a claim over another person can use the provisions of this act. Now look at this. I told you and explained to you about the regular procedure. Now this comes not under the regular procedure, but as a summary procedure. What's the difference? Right? What's the difference? Section 2. This is a short act comparatively, and it's a very useful act. Right? Section 2. Sorry, Section 3. An action under this act shall be instituted by presenting a plaint in the form specified in the civil procedure code. You can't have any other format that you require, but you have to use this particular what do you call format which is provided in the civil procedure code. Now section 4 again is amended. So you look at what section 4 in the new act is, right? So subsection 1 of section 4 is amended, and it states that the institution suing shall on presenting the plaint. You look at and read these words and phrases over and over. It is important, it's a prerequisite that the institution which is suing under this act, along with the plaint with their filing, they should file an affidavit to the effect that the sum that they are claiming is lawfully due to the institution from the defendant. So together with the plaint, you need an affidavit, right? Claiming that the sum amount claiming is lawfully due. Then a draft decree nisi. This is how you pronounce it. A draft decree nisi, right? Nisi Agnya Ketumpada. Draft decree nisi. Nisi Agnya Ketumpada. And for service thereof, and shall in addition file in court, right? So plaint, affidavit, decree nisi, draft decree nisi. Nisi Agnya කියලා කියනවා. Agnya Ketumpada. And service thereof shall in addition file in court such number of copies of the plaint සහ පිටපත් which is required, අවශ්‍ය තරම් පිටපත් of that plaint, affidavit, instrument or agreement or document sued upon or relied on by the institution as in is equal to the number of defendants in the actions, right? So it's not enough for you to just file the plaint as in the normal action. You need to file the originals of the instrument which you are suing upon, the agreement. So you get the facility offer letters, facility agreement forms, the checks if there are, and the documents sued upon. If it is not there, your case will be thrown out, right? Then you can't institute fresh action on that. Be careful, right? Then, if some prayed for in the plaint, if any instrument, agreement, or document is produced to court, right, and the same appears to the court to be properly stamped, so you need to ensure that these things are being complied with. Where such instrument or agreement is required by law to be stamped, it should be stamped. For an example, promissory notes, you need it to be, it should be stamped, right? If I'm not mistaken, 0.1%. If the stamps are not there, that promissory note is not valid. If that promissory note is filed, which is not properly stamped, your action is gone for a 6, right? Keep that in mind. And not to be open to suspicion by reason of any alteration or erasure, right? Or other matter on the face of it, and not to be barred by prescription, and the court being satisfied of the contents contained in the affidavit referred, right, shall enter a decree nisi in the form set out in the first schedule, which have already filed, right? And the court may allow at the time of making the decree nisi, together with such other relief prayed for by the institution as to the court may seem meet, and the decree nisi shall be served on the defendant in the manner hereinafter provided. So I'm reading subsection 2 of section 4, right? Here, this is what I just read. So the court, some prayed for in the institution suing shall on presenting the plaint file an affidavit to the effect that the sum prayed for in the plaint justly due to the institution. O1. right? It's repealed and this was replaced by this. Then 2, some mention is replaced by some prayed fine. So we covered these areas now. Then we come to section 4.3. Section 4.3. From the defendant's residence to the court, and no further time shall be given to the defendant. Right. Now, 4.3 speaks of the time allowed by the courts for the defendant to come. Right. Now, remember, this is not a regular procedure. In regular procedure, after the plaint, the court will issue summons for the defendant to come to court and file its answer. So the defendant has a right to come and file answer. Here, the date to be inserted in the decree nisi as the date for the defendant's appearance and showing cause, if any, against it shall be as early as a day and as can conveniently be named, regard being had to the distance here from the distance from the defendant's residence to court. So even the distance has been taken into account and been considered, right? Then subsection 4 is repealed and replaced by this particular subsection. The affidavit to be filed by the institution under subsection 1 shall be made by a principal officer of such institution having personal knowledge of the facts of the course of action, and such person shall in his affidavit swear or affirm that he deposit from his own personal knowledge to the matters therein, right? So the affidavit cannot be signed by any person in the bank. It should be signed by a principal officer of the bank. There are decided cases to determine who is a principal officer. Principal officer can be any manager or officer who is responsible in the executive grade who can vouch for these facts. Right? If you have any questions, you can ask me. Keep these things in mind. What do you call it? Section 4 says that subsection 1, when the institution is presenting the plaint and file the affidavit, draft decree nisi and everything, that cannot be open for any suspicion, right? Understood? Section 4, right? Then we go to subsection 5 is repealed because it's already covered, right? Then we go to section 5. What happens when the decree nisi is orderly be sent? Now, decree nisi will be sent together with that whole set of documents, that is the plaint, affidavit, the instrument sued upon, the agreement, and the documents which they have relied on, to the defendant together with the decree nisi. Now, this decree nisi is not summons like in the regular action. This is a decree nisi. What do you call it? This is more or less a temporary, not a temporary, it's an order, a provisional order, you can say. A provisional order which is already made against the defendant. It shall be subject to the provisions of section 5B and ordinarily served by registered post to the address of the defendant. If the defendant is a public officer, the court can decide whether to send that to by registered post, and a copy of the decree nisi in duplicate to be sent to the head of the department in which the defendant is employed. So if that is being served on the head of the department, it is his duty to serve that copy of that to the defendant personally, right? And to return the others copy of the decree nisi to court with either an acknowledgement of receipt of the decree nisi by the defendant or with a statement of service of the decree nisi endorsed So either the head of the department can acknowledge that and send to court saying that yes, I received the decree nisi, or and defendant agreed to that, or I simply personally served it on the defendant, right? If the defendant is not a public officer and is in employment of another, again the court can decide to send a copy in duplicate to the defendant's employer, and the employer likewise has the duty as to cause a copy of that decree to the defendant and send an acknowledgement to the court, right? So again, in subsection 4, they have described as to who is the head of department when it comes to army and so on and so forth. You can leisurely read these things in your leisure time. And new sections 5A, 5B, and 5C in the principal enactment is added where it was not there in the earlier, right? 5A, 5B, 5C. Right. 5A says proof of service. If the decree nisi is registered post, sent through registered post, the advice of delivery of the registered letter is received, then that's sufficient proof. If it is served by the defendant under subsection 203, that is the head of department, and acknowledgement of the receipt by the head of the department is sufficient notice. The court is satisfied the decree has been sent to the defendant by registered post, but no advice delivery. It shall authorize the fiscal of the court. Fiscal niladariya කියලා කියන. Or any other officer authorized by court to affix the decree nisi to some conspicuous place. හොඳට පෙනෙන තැනක. Part of the house. And it should be deemed by it is duly served on the defendant. The court is satisfied that the decree nisi has been sent to the defendant by registered post. All these are the methods, right? It is deemed that it is duly served, right? Or else, under 5B, the court, on application made to it, in lieu of service in the decree nisi by registered post or by serving or tendering to deliver through a process officer, to deliver to the fiscal, may deliver it through personally through a process officer, right? And the process officer shall affix the decree nisi if he cannot, after following all the due diligence to serve the decree nisi on the defendant, he can also paste it in a conspicuous place, right, where the defendant ordinary resides. It shall be the duty of the process officer on decree nisi being served on defendant or any other person on his behalf to require the signature or the thumb impression of the person. This section speaks of the method of issue of decree nisi to the defendant. Right? Then you see, no, not this. Right? Again, process officer can be the fiscal officer of the court or a private person appointed. Manner of service done through process officer is covered under 5C. Now, what happens thereafter? It's an important section. Section 6 of the principal enactment, which is again amended. Section 6(1) says an action instituted under this act, the defendant shall not appear or show cause against the decree nisi unless he obtains leave from the court to appear and show cause. So this is not like the regular procedure. The defendant does not have a right, so to speak, to appear and enter into the case by filing his answer. No, he can't do that. What he can do is he have to obtain leave from the court to appear and show cause. Right? Section 2 of section 6, subsection 2 of section 6 is amended by the Act, amending Act. This is a very important act. In courts, majority of the issues and appeals are on this section. It says the court shall, upon the filing by the defendant of an application for leave to appear and show cause, leave to appear and show cause, supported by affidavit, which should deal specifically with the plaintiff's claim and state clearly and concisely what the defense to the claim is and what the facts that he relied upon to support it. So he have to be given opportunity of being heard. After hearing that party, the court has these three powers. What are the three powers? First one, the court can allow the defendant to come and fight the case after depositing in court the sum amount claimed by the plaintiff. First one. Second one, the court can allow the defendant to come. So the first one speaks of monetary or cash to be deposited. Second one, the court can allow them, furnishing such security as the court may appear reasonably and sufficient for satisfying. So it may not be cash itself or monetary amount. It can be maybe a bank guarantee or maybe any other security that is sufficient to satisfy the claim of the defendant. Now the third one is the most popular and unpopular within courts. I'm saying the court can use the discretion there. If the court is satisfied with the defense of the defendant and the court says this, I think there is a prima facie case on the defense of the defendant, the court can order an amount as security and framing and recording of issues otherwise as the court thinks fit. Not the entire amount, as the other two subsections stated, court can decide what needs to be done. Right? So when the court says that, unlike in a regular action, in the summary procedure, the defendant will have to do either of those three things, what the court orders. If not, the defendant can't or doesn't have the right to enter into the case and fight. So subsection 3 says, if the defendant fails to appear and show cause, or having appeared, his application to show cause is refused, the court shall make the decree nisi absolute. Right? For this purpose, the judge shall endorse the words decree nisi made absolute. Nisi තීන්දු ප්‍රකාශය නියත තීන්දු ප්‍රකාශයක් ලෙස ප්‍රකාශයට පත් කරනවා. Decree nisi made absolute. So keep this in mind, right? These are quite important areas because I have seen a lot of questions being questioned over a period of time in your past papers on this, right? So there is a greater probability as against a possibility that these may be questioned, and on top of it, it's for your knowledge, right? Then the next most important thing is, if the defendant was not present when the order making decree nisi absolute is made, you can't appeal on that decision unless you take, or the defendant take, permission or obtain permission from the original court. You can't appeal on that on the basis that you were not there to declare to entertain an application. Right? Where the ground on which an application is made on that particular subsection, right? 6A1, The court may set aside the decree absolute upon such terms and conditions as the court shall consider it just and right to impose upon the applicant and upon the decree absolute being set aside. Now, where an application by way of summary procedure is instituted under subsection 1, you have to follow the provisions in the civil procedure code. You don't need to be very concerned about these areas. Summary procedure and civil procedure code is provided from section 380 onwards. They have to follow those areas. Then the next most important thing for you to be aware of is, section 8, it's again amended. In any proceedings under this act, the court may order that the original of the instrument, agreement or other document, copies of which were filed with the plaintiff on which the action is founded, be made available for examination by the court when the action is supported in court, and such instrument, agreement or document cannot be returned to the plaintiff after such examination. Shall be returned to the plaintiff. Right? So keep these things in mind. Those are the most important provisions with regard to the debt recovery. So you have to look at section 2, section 3, 4, 5, 5A, 6, 7. Right? Six A, 7. Then award of compensation, section 11 says, where it appears to the court that a decree nisi entered in an action instituted here, so obtained by willful suppression or non-disclosure of any relevant facts, or if by the plaintiff, if by the bank, that is, if after the entering of the decree, the decree nisi is discharged and dismissed, the defendant can claim damages, right, from the bank. Right? Then, if the defendant appears before court in response to the decree nisi and does not contest the matter, let's say there's a customer who doesn't contest on the matter, doesn't dispute, he says, yes, I defaulted on this matter, but give me some time to repay this. If the parties are agreeable, the court can grant that wish to be paid. And does not if they don't contest, the court can press to liquidate the debt instrument. The court shall, with the approval of both parties, record that and enter settlement. That settlement will stay the proceedings, right? Stay the proceedings of the courts. Then the other important areas are these. Wait. Now, if, for an example, there is a decree, whatever the order that is given by the court, and the party is, whatever the party is not happy with that order, he can appeal it to the next level of court, that is the High Court of Civil Appeals. Civil Abhiyachana Mahadhikarණයට අපෑලක් ඉදිරිපත් කළ හැකි. If that is being done, proceedings in the original court will not be automatically stayed unless the higher court gives an order to that effect after ordering the defendant or the appellant to the person who is appealing to make such deposits in the original court. Right? I know these are a little bit technical, but then again, I am giving you the most important sections under this, right? For you to record that, and thereafter you be in a position. So now you are in a position to record this. No. So have your notes in place, and you can revisit these areas and see whether you understood. And these are the salient sections insofar as this course is concerned that you need to be concerned of. right? Then we come to another important area of the Debt Recovery Act. If you remember a while ago, we were talking about bills of exchange and certain functions, liabilities and responsibilities of certain parties to the bills of exchange. And we were talking about countermanding payments to, then returning of checks. So many matters. Now, in order to ensure the speedy recovery and stuff like that, the legislature by this law has made provisions under section 25 to this effect, right? Section 25. Look at this. Any person who knowingly draws a check which is dishonored by a bank for want of funds, which means there are no funds, he writes a check, or gives an order to a banker to pay a sum of money which payment is not made by a reason of there being no obligation on such banker to make payment, or there may be a reason for that banker not to make a payment. So many reasons. One is the account is closed, or the order given being subsequently countermanded with a dishonest intention. Look at that. If there are instances where where a person issues a check without no money in the account and knowing that there are no money in the account, or issues a check knowing that the bank has no responsibility or an obligation to honor that, maybe because he has closed the account, his account is dormant, so many reasons, or he countermands that payment with a dishonest intention, right? Dishonest intention, or gives an authority to an institution to pay a sum of money to itself in payment of a debt or a loan or any part thereof, or to such institution from and out of the account maintained, or funds deposited by such person with such institution, and such institution is unable to make such payment to itself by reason of such person not placing adequate funds in such account, or by reason of the funds deposited having been withdrawn by reason of such person countermanding. Or no, it comes then, and having accepted an inland bill refuses to payment dishonestly shall be guilty of an offense under this act. Look at this. This is the most important part. Shall be guilty and shall on conviction by magistrate after summary trial will be liable to punishment with imprisonment of either description. That is rigorous imprisonment or simple imprisonment. Sulu ho බරපතල වැඩ සහිත සිර දඬුවම්, which may be extended to 1 year or with fine of 10,000 rupees or 10% of the full value of the check. Right? This is quite important. If these are offenses, right? If that offense which they have spoke of, they have introduced section 25A, if it's committed by a body of persons, if that body of persons is a body corporate, that means a company, limited liability company, every director, manager or secretary of that body corporate, if it's a firm, every partner of that firm, it's an unincorporated body, every individual who is a member of such body shall be guilty of the offense. So this is an area where the criminal sanction or the criminal liability is imputed to a person who is issuing a check without funds or countermanding payment without funds in the account, which is very what do you call this is to deter such activities, right? That is to deter such activities. That is one thing that I needed to cover. The other thing is, now under the Civil Procedure Code Amendment Act, any monetary claim which is over 25 million should be instituted not in the district court but in the commercial high court. කොළඹ වාණිජ මහාධිකරණය තමයි දාන්න ඕන නීතිය. However, if it's an action under the Debt Recovery Act without being concerned about the amount, as I mentioned earlier, you have to institute the action in the district court, not in commercial high court. If you institute in commercial high court, it's wrong. So commercial high court have exclusive powers, or you call it exclusive jurisdiction, to hear disputes with regard to matters coming under Debt Recovery Special Provisions Act. Any questions? Any questions? You should be having questions. I am reiterating that it's important that you go through these provisions over and over. We get the questions on debt recovery. How do we get questions on debt recovery? So you may get questions on debt recovery. Now, on the first question, there are 10 mandatory questions, which you will get 2 marks each, scoring 20. My experience is that students who pass the exam will at least have to. This is the generic, the perception. Students who generally pass the exam will have to at least score 14 out of 20. So there may be short questions in question number 1. In answering to your question, question is, how do we get questions on debt recovery? You may get short multiple choice questions. So in that 10 questions, first 5 is multiple choice. Next 5 is short answers. You can get those under the first question, either as a multiple or short answers. Or you may get in the main questions as a sub question. For example, a main question consists of, I think, 16 marks or 18 marks, I can't remember. It may have 2 components. I think 16 or 18, I can't remember. So 50% of it may be covered under debt recovery. Other 50%, which may be or most likely to be covered under recoveries of loans or parata execution, right? So you may get a big question on that, maybe either 9 marks. Is it 20? 20? Yeah, it's a 20, I think. The whole allocation is 20. So it's a 10 mark. I have to verify that information. I don't have that papers with me at the moment. That's how you would get the questions. But these provisions which I discussed with you are the areas that is more applicable to a banker rather than a lawyer. So section 2, 3, 4, 5, 5A, B, C, section 6, section 7, 8, section 6A, right? Then section 25. Section 25. I hope I answered your question. Any other questions? Any other question? Hmm? So we have covered ahead of schedule. If you have any questions, you can of course write to me. You already have my email address. Otherwise, we can wind up for today. All the very best.